Few knew, even amongst the wealthiest and therefore brightest of civilization, exactly how ships of this size were capable of housing, let alone feeding so very many people. Roughly 2 million per colony ship, 20,000 of which lived in the relative comfort their class earned them above deck, with the remaining lower class rabble living in more conservative keepings below. Talk of above and below was not entirely literal, but instead a holdover from humanity's long-distant seafaring past. Technically outer and inner would be a more apt descriptor, as those amongst the educated classes lived on the surface of these mammoth space transports, while the core of the vessels were populated by the poor. However, while technically inaccurate, the imagery invoked by the dated terminology was not. It was whispered at high teas by those who dealt in gossip that below deck was reportedly cramped, dull, overcrowded and smelly. Further, due to their close proximity to the ship's engines, it was said that an irritating, dull hum plagued their every waking moment. Food served below, the wife of a wealthy business owner may gasp, was served cold and without spice. So the rumours ran. Usually such discussions, especially when taking place at events so regal as high teas, would of course be met with counters. Even if, a lawyer may postulate, accommodation below is so bad as the gossipers spout, or the bleeding hearts bleat, they are, he would quickly point out, indisputably an improvement on the crime-plagued slums they left behind. Such postulations would be met with hear-hears, cheers, and hearty backslaps. Most of those amongst the upper class were very impressed with the lives they had built for those below. It was even with some resentment that the wealthy felt the poor had become so much better off than they had comparatively been. After all, while the prospects of those below may have purportedly slightly improved, in contrast, the livelihoods of those above had very slightly diminished. That is not to say living on the outer level was an unpleasant existence, mind you. It just wasn't the paradise to which they had become accustomed. The recycled oxygen pumped around by whisper-quiet, discreet air ducts, though fresh, would often have an unpleasant metallic taste, and while their penthouse-style accommodation gave them views of the stars, privacy, and moderate space, their size was dwarfed by the mansions of which they once resided. This nostalgia for yesteryear, as so often does, ignored the bad days that came towards the end. It forgot how the planet had become poisoned, and how the stars had been blacked out by smog. Even before the smog, the view of the stars was not seen so clearly as they were now through the giant domes that surrounded the Aphrodite. This magnificent Olympic-class colony ship, as well as the 12 others that made up the migratory fleet, gave those residents of the upper levels ever-changing views of the stars, as these Titan-sized transports propelled themselves even further from their increasingly unlivable homeworld towards a brighter future. Though these views were denied to those who lived below, they, despite their magnificence, were by the higher classes largely ignored. It had not always been this way. When the journey began, the stars had fascinated those amongst the small dwellings that populated the ship's surface. However, interest had long since faded, and now much of the educated class was suffering an ailment almost exclusively reserved for the privileged. After lives spent going and doing whatever they pleased, now resigned to months on end spent in one place, smaller than even the most compact of Earth's cities, and forced to interact with only those two residing in the upper levels of their particular ship of 12, they were, many of them, mind-numbingly bored. And it is in this very situation we find David. 8 years it had taken, 8 years of drinks splashed, sheets ruffled, and cheeks slapped before David, a modest millionaire from the Orion banking conglomerate, had either got with or been rejected by every single viable female sexual partner aboard this godforsaken marvel of human engineering and modern transportation. David did not know what fueled the Aphrodite, nor how it propelled itself through the vast blackness of space. And David did not care to know the logistics, few were privy to, as to how a vessel of this size was capable of housing, let alone feeding so very many people. What David did know was that an Olympic-class colony ship housed 2 million people, most of which, in an attempt to avoid some of the unpleasant class-based clashes that had occurred in the cities left behind, were, both to protect us from them and them from ambition, sealed off from David and his 20,000 peers. Of those 20,000 elite, when removing men, children, the elderly and relatives, left David with only 5,000 prospective sexual partners, all of whose prospects David reflected glumly as a delicate pale hand delivered a sting-inducing slap across his cheek, he had now thoroughly exercised. It had been a long 8 years. Too long, David felt, and as he walked the streets of the upper deck he now called home, met at every corner with either flirtatious smiles or unveiled scorn, he felt himself Alexander the Great, who wept, for there were no lands left to conquer. "I strongly believe in healing the divide," David said 2 days later, while sipping from a glass of a very good year that would have cost most lower deckers a few very hard ones. "You what?" scoffed Bradley, who was more paying attention to his drink's melting ice cubes than he was anything else. "Between the classes, a consultation must be had," David ventured. "You just want to get laid," came the counter. Several seconds of silence followed. A pleasant but entirely false breeze blew, and the pair consumed several standard paychecks worth of scotch in 2 small sips. The view from Bradley's balcony of the small shipboard city was as picturesque as it had been for 8 years, and would be for 4 more. If it were not for the star patterns peeking through the false sky projected on their surrounding dome, one might be fooled into believing the cityscape before them was entirely terrestrial. "I can't see these places and people for another 48 hours, let alone another 48 months. I need to experience some fresh scenery," David finally continued. "Regardless of her standing," came Bradley's retort. It stung more than David liked to admit, but also bred in him an unfamiliar defiance. "I've memorized every face on this accursed deck, but down there are 2 million people. 2 million people I could talk with, laugh with, drink with, sleep with, awkwardly avoid for the remainder of the voyage with," Bradley continued in an equally enthusiastic tone. "It is illegal, David," Bradley stated matter-of-factly, humorous tone now gone from his voice. "It's not," protested David. "Well, no," Bradley conceded, before adding, "but it is taboo, and not suitable of someone of your standing. Dangerous also, probably. You saw the news back home," he began to lecture. David had seen the news back home, and for a moment visions of protests, riots, and all-out street brawls flashed through his mind. He had attempted to counter his companion's point, arguing that it was no longer like that, and that the ship provided for their needs, but ultimately he gave up, promising his friend he would stay out of the lower level. A promise some might claim David somewhat neglected, when he squeezed himself through the air vents responsible for the pleasant fake breezes and began his descent. The long winding air ducts did not remain as pleasant as the air they emit for long. Soon they became low, narrow, and the breeze began to shift away from cool to comfortably warm, and finally the stiflingly dry heat of a desert. Further, with each air filter David passed, an unpleasant odour began to manifest. David did not complain about this. Complaining about the poor living conditions in an air duct would have been elitist, even for someone of his background. And besides, he only needed to stay within the cramped tubing long enough to circumvent the thick bulkheads, locked security doors, and winding personnel passageways that separated the upper from the lower levels. It was, however, not long after that, due to the increasingly unbearable heat and ever more repugnant odour, David decided the very next maintenance hatch was probably just far enough. Straining the latch open and quietly dropping to the floor with a noisy clatter of clumsy, cramped limbs, David found himself in a confusing setting. Firstly, the room, if it was a room he now stood in, was somehow even hotter than the narrow ducts. Secondly, whether it be due to the thick smoke that surrounded him, or the stench that now had an unsettling thickness to it, David found it difficult to breathe. David could not simply climb back into the air duct and retreat to the safety of the upper levels. The drop down had been too great. Further, with every smoke-filled breath he took, David could feel his strength weaken. It would not be long before he would be unable to hoist the weight of his own body, even if he were able to reach the vent's lip. Desperate to escape the suffocating atmosphere, David picked a direction through the obscuring darkness of the smoke and ran. With laboured step after laboured step, David willed himself through the thick black smoke with motions that resemble more a drunken stagger than the fear-fueled sprint he intended. And as he ran or lumbered, visions of news broadcasts from the home he had left behind flashed through his mind. Riots, protests, a peaceful march for equality sparking a violent clash of ideology. They had done this. They had ruined the earth. And now they had ruined the lower level. And now David choked on the flames of their barbarous insolence. David's eyes stung with smoke and teared with anger as hot as his surroundings, but in the distance the smoke thinned, and the silhouette of a man became clearer. David had not seen a full-body armour-clad police officer for 8 years, and even then only on the news. Their formidable-looking jet-black coverings had always been a welcome reassurance when viewed on the broadcasts, their strong lines pushing back protesters, their violent necessity that kept the peace. Here, however, in person, shadowed by the smoke and yet somehow still lit by an unseen glow, any preamble of reassurance was gone, and his imagination attributed to the officer an almost demonic aura. David shook his head as he stepped forward, both clearing his mind and moving further into less polluted air. This man was an officer of the law, a government employee, but more importantly, paid by his taxes. This excursion had already become more than he had intended, and now David decided he cared not for whatever civic unrest had caused this, whatever this was, nor did he care that he himself was not entirely technically supposed to be down here. Planning to hail the officer, demand an escort back to the upper level, and put this entire ordeal behind him with a shower and a brandy, David put to approaching the officer. With each step forward the smoke thinned, and he rehearsed in his head what he might say to the dark figure, and then the curtain lifted fully. It took 2 subsequent steps for David to become fully aware of his surroundings, which stopped him dead in his tracks. Instantly, questions he had not asked were answered, which immediately gave rise to further questions. What David saw turned his legs to lead and made moving an impossibility. Mountains of corpses. What looked like David could well imagine was the entire populace of the lower level. Some piles static, others being pushed by monolithic bulldozers into towering furnaces. The origin of the smoke was answered, and the smell was explained. But what had happened here? A plague? An epidemic? But then, newly contextualized, less pleasant questions began to nag at David. How exactly were ships of this size capable of housing, let alone feeding so very many people? Looking around, the answer seemed sickeningly apparent to David. They were not, nor were they ever intended to be. There were no living quarters in the lower levels. There were no people, just giant furnaces and their fuel. The last hope for humanity had been launched on the unwilling, unknowing sacrifice of the lower classes. David wanted to run, he wanted to scream, but instead found himself unable to move or utter a sound. Somewhere from outside the tunnelling echo that almost completely drowned out his vision and hearing, a curious sentence was spoken. "We've got a live one," it said. And then everything went black. Two years later, the Olympic-class colony ship Aphrodite arrived at Earth 2, the new home for humanity. The residents of the upper levels were saddened to hear that those in the lower levels of their ship, due to an unfortunate fuel leakage, had suffered significant carbon monoxide poisoning during the journey, and had died out. They were further saddened to hear that this design flaw had been common across all 12 Olympic-class colony ships. "An utter tragedy," one new Earth resident remarked. "If only offset by Earth 2 no longer facing such overpopulation issues as Earth 1 had," he went on, feeling proud to have found a silver lining to such tragedy. The rest of those gathered were in agreement, and talked optimistically over raised glasses of expensive wine. After all, while tragedy had undeniably struck them on their journey, at least those who had survived, they reflected, were the wealthiest, most well-educated, and most morally upstanding of humanity. The future was bright.